macro problem is that all of our industries that are hard to abate sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, materials, we're all producing way too much greenhouse gas emissions with our business as usual operations. And when you look at the split of greenhouse gases per industry, agriculture, depending on the country or the metric that you're looking, so it's somewhere between 11% and as high as 25% of all total GHG emissions across sectors. This is fairly counterintuitive if you think about the industry that is literally nurturing or managing the land and interacting with the environment. So there is a question, why is this happening? Where are these emissions? How can we reduce them? How can we make agricultural production as a process more environmentally friendly?
Welcome to this episode of Abstraction, a podcast that with the help of Australia and New Zealand's leading entrepreneurs, investors and experts, breaks down the complexity of emerging tech trends. My name is Hunter Watkin. I'm a tech startup investor at Rampazand, an early stage venture capital firm, and I'm on a mission to learn out in the open with those curious to understand what's currently possible when it comes to emerging technologies and bring to light how people and companies are overcoming the obstacles that lie ahead. This season is all about carbon-related technology. I'll speak to guests using tech, engineering and science to drive carbon removal and reduction projects, as well as the investors and leaders mobilising change in what many of my guests are calling the decisive decade. You can catch every episode by subscribing on Spotify, YouTube and Apple Podcasts, or following me, Hunter Watkin, on LinkedIn and Twitter, so you don't miss a beat. Before diving into this episode, please be aware that nothing expressed throughout constitutes financial or investment advice. We hope you enjoy. I am joined today by Anastasia Volkova, the founder of Regrow. Regrow is a tech company that powers the business case for sustainable agriculture with the combination of ground truth, big data, and satellite data. Anastasia, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Anastasia, your startup journey started quite some time ago. I was informed by one of your investors that it actually started while you were completing a PhD. I don't know if you on reflection would advise that, but can you tell us a little bit about your journey to starting what used to be called Fluorosat and has now evolved to Regrow?
I would definitely advise that more academics look at commercialization opportunities, maybe through partnerships, but generally no regrets on the journey. You're right, it all started in parallel to my PhD as far as the company goes, but there's definitely work that I have done with the groups that also led to starting other companies or partnering with me on starting this company before. And so I wouldn't say I walked into a PhD and then it dawned on me to start a business. I'm a businesswoman who walked into a PhD. It's more that direction that it's always been trending. I'm very passionate about solving problems, and looking for a solution to a problem has been that path that led me through a master's into a PhD. But at the same time, I have high level of conviction that the businesses are the sustainable drivers of change, because that's how you actually make the change into the business model and make it accessible and sticky for years to come. It's not necessarily something that a non-profit can do. It's not sticky. That is not a transformational change. And sometimes technology is the enabling factor. It's the unlock of going from something that maybe was too costly or couldn't be as transparent or simply couldn't be quantified at the scale at which it needed to be monitored or quantified for us to be making useful decisions. There's a lot of breakthroughs that have happened for Regrow to come together. Regrow is a product of not just part of the insight that I've developed in earlier days working with other companies and in parallel on my PhD, but also it's a merger between two companies that has really led to Regrow. In the other part that wasn't Fluorosat, it was Bill Salas and a group of his co-founders started DAG around soil carbon model license that they've initially developed with an inventor of the model. It's a soil carbon simulator that really looks at the environmental impacts of agriculture. And it was a really great fit between what I was already exploring in Fluorosat across the crop side of things and the yield side of things, and adding the environmental outcomes that made a lot of sense, because we could be not only agronomically informed, but holistically driving the decisions of our stakeholders across the food ag supply chain.
Before diving into the details of Dagon and the synergies a bit more with Fluorosat and how that's evolved into Regrow, can you explain a little bit about the climate problem at a macro level that Regrow is addressing and why, I guess, it's extra complicated in the field of agriculture?
And the macro problem is that all of our industries that are hard to abate sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, materials, we're all producing way too much greenhouse gas emissions with our business as usual operations. And when you look at the split of greenhouse gases per industry, agriculture, depending on the country or the metric that you're looking, so it's somewhere between 11% and as high as 25% of all total GHG emissions across sectors. This is fairly counterintuitive if you think about the industry that is literally nurturing or managing the land and interacting with the environment. So there is a question, why is this happening? Where are these emissions? How can we reduce them? How can we make agricultural production as a process more environmentally friendly? And just before we dive into that, I do think it's worth also looking at the spiral that it's in. So on its own, agriculture is contributing greenhouse gas emissions to climate, but then climate is contributing the volatility to agricultural production. The more volatile a climate is, the harder it is to guarantee agricultural production. The more we need to ensure it, diversify it, make it resilient. So that definitely is a challenge worth resolving much sooner rather than later, because whenever you get into a vicious cycle, it's a lot harder to slow it down in its higher levels of the spiral. So back to the sources of greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. I've already touched on it with this large use case of fertiliser management. And if we're over-applying fertiliser or applying it at the wrong time or in the wrong amount or in the wrong place or the wrong product, that it simply does not get fully absorbed by the plants that it's intended for, or we end up with the surplus either volatilized back into the air as nitrogen molecules that are 100 times more potent as greenhouse gas molecules compared to carbon. Or we end up with the leaching of that fertilizer into fresh waters where we see algae bloom downstream. So this is literally like flushing money downstream. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. So why would you ask, is this happening? The simple answer is that it has been in farming such an original and volatile series of decades. And once we've invented the synthetic fertilizer manufacturing process, we were able to increase the margin ever so slightly. So, for example, if you had a good year, you had enough fertilizer, and it was a good rainfall at the right time, you would really produce a great crop. So it wasn't necessarily worth it to cut the fertilizer amount that you applied because you'd be foregoing this additional benefit you could potentially have. So you could think of it that it was an insurance on those crops. And now we're starting to really look at embracing the externalities of what is the damage downstream and how can we share the risk with the farm in a different way. Who are the buyers from this farm? Who are the authorities from the government or environmental perspective that care about the area where this farming is happening? Even the human health organizations are getting involved because obviously you have a choice of either paying the farms so they can pursue the practices that they want to pursue, but not necessarily able to fund, or you can build a very expensive water filtration facility. So there's definitely very specific costs to doing this the way that we have done it. We've optimized the agricultural system for a goal that wasn't necessarily inclusive of an environmental impact of that system. And that system performed for the goal we intended. Post 2 world wars, we wanted to feed the planet so we would get out of a war state. And the current situation in Ukraine definitely is another hot button in that same chapter of history. So there's nothing for us to regret that we've done the way we've done. We've tried to optimize it for something to, feed 2 additional billion people that depend on the synthetic fertilizer production. But now we're certainly looking at it from the perspective of what could we do? What can be done on the farm? How can we diversify the rotation? get the nutrient for plants from the rotation? How can we ensure that farms be more sustained from the nutrient perspective, from the water holding capacity, improve the quality of the soil? So whenever we have a really big rain or drought, we can actually have that farm sustain itself a bit more. And so many other aspects of farming tied into this greenhouse gas conversation.
And when it comes to making farmers and farms more resourceful, one of your anchor quotes I've read in some of your articles is one from Peter Drucker, which basically says, if you can't measure it, you cannot manage it. What does this mean in the context of Regrow, and how have you gone about first measuring in order to manage this problem for an array of customers?
It's a fairly known quote, and I think it's true for so many systems. How can we possibly improve or manage something that we cannot measure? So what is it that we're trying to manage here? We're trying to manage the practices on agricultural land. We're trying to change them to improve them. We're trying to finance farmers to be able to undergo that transition. And we're trying to manage greenhouse gas emissions for reduction or removal in the first place and the second place. So how are we doing that? We need to know how to measure them. So all these pieces come down to the ability to quantify. What are the practices on the landscape? How many hectares do we have practices this versus that? How much wheat or chickpeas or oil seeds get produced in this country or for this particular brand according to these practices versus those practices? And what does it mean from the greenhouse gas perspective? What are total tons of CO2 equivalent associated with the production of this commodity in this way, in this landscape, this year, with as much detail as you can possibly imagine?
And so when we talk about the data that you're collecting and the technology that you use to measure, what is the mix of technologies that you're using, and why can't they in isolation necessarily deliver value and measure it effectively?
Well, just like with every solution, you look at what the status quo is, or with every problem, you look at the status quo. What is the status quo for the space? How can we know what the farmers are doing on the landscape? We can send a bunch of people to drive around and look at farms and talk to them and distribute a bunch of surveys. And that would cost a lot of money and frankly generate more greenhouse gas emissions from us flying and driving around. What we can also do on that farm to measure the state of soil as well as the aspects of an emission profile of the production on that farm is to take, for example, soil samples and send them to the lab. And whilst this is definitely a way of getting a sense of a point in time soil carbon level of that soil, we can also look at it from a longer term perspective and say, not only that also requires people to go out in the landscape as well as send the samples to the lab, it also only gives us a point in time estimate, which is valuable information. But how do you extrapolate from that? How do you get to near real-time decision making? There's definitely gaps in how we can take this extremely resource intensive, quite costly, frankly, methods of doing it. And how can you scale it so you can get this data in the future on every piece of arable land in the world? Like that's the level at which we need to know it to truly manage it. So it goes bridging the gap with several technologies that work in unison and complement each other. When we talk about monitoring the farm practices, I'm not talking about individual farmers and knowing their field boundaries and knowing their farm extents. I'm talking about if there's wheat production in the state of Victoria, how is it going? There's all the questions from, are we producing potentially enough to feed ourselves and to continue to export, to how are we producing that? Is it in the rotation with the right crops? Again, is it feeding the soil? Is it improving things from year to year? Or is it making them ever so slightly worse? So the combination of this large-scale data gets us to a fairly good perspective on what is going on in the landscape to be able to see some acute challenges or patterns down to field level, but more importantly, aggregate. So we can motivate and provide the right level of information to those who are buyers from the landscape or investors into the landscape. So this is just on the practices side. And I keep talking about two sides, practices sides and outcomes. So on the practices, we just talk about remote sensing and other data helps us monitor them. Then we use that information plus the inputs from farmers, if they're enrolled in programs, or our default knowledge about what farming practices will be in the region to model the impact of management, of application of those practices on the landscape. So if we are monitoring this field has particular series of crops and it's likely managed to this level to produce a good yield, what does that look like from the impact perspective? So how is the yield trending over time? What can improve it? As well as the environmental aspect, so soil carbon, as well as net GHG emissions that would include nitrogen or methane for systems like rice and dairy. And effectively, we're talking about cloud-based software that is informed by thousands upon thousands, real-world measurements and data points and contributions from farmers, agronomists themselves, wanting to make these systems work better for them, because ultimately they can take the benefit and take them to the buyer and say, I'm producing something that's way more beneficial for your supply chain and for the environment. We will need to pay them for it one way or the other, either upfront or when they made an investment as a bit of a recompensation. So we're definitely providing this data to stakeholders to shift the incentives in the system and align them with the new state we want it to be in.
When it comes to the incentives that you say are being shifted, you talk about farmers taking the regrow solution to the buyers. Can you shed a little bit more light on who the users of regrow technology are and their relationship with buyers and the ultimate customers of regrow?
Definitely. It looks more the other way around, if I'm very specific about how this works in the landscape. I just wanted to talk it through from the perspective of the farmer, because this is where the impact happens, this is where the support happens. But the way that it gets to the farmer is by being funded by their buyers. So the farmer isn't buying the solution. The farmer is usually the recipient of the access to the solution on behalf of their buyers. There's usually a separation of data, so there's not a very significant concern around the farmer data getting into the supply chain upstream. This is why there's a regrow step, there's aggregation that I keep talking about. So the farmer gets advice that's relevant for their farm, but the brand sees the information on the supply chain level. What's important to think about when we talk about the agricultural system transformation, we need to engage with those that have both responsibility and the margins to invest into the system. And it happens that large organizations at the edges of the supply chain, as well as in the middle of the supply chain, can really get involved here. And this is who Regrow partners with to drive the solution adoption of the landscape market. It can be aggregators of commodities. It can be brands, so from food manufacturers to food grocery retailers, bring the solution back down the supply chain. You can say, or usually they say it's upstream. The farmer is upstream and the consumer is downstream. So they're going back up the supply chain to their suppliers, to their suppliers, to their suppliers, and eventually to the farm. But we're seeing the strengthening of the supply chain through these conversations, because effectively for all the brands, put simply, majority of their greenhouse gas emissions is on the farm. So they are very motivated to reinstitute or strengthen the partnerships in the supply chain and come to the farmers, to their cooperative, to their mill, whoever is aggregating their supply, or to their directly internally procurement organization, and talk to them about the importance of these programs, the importance of reduction of what is Scope 3 emissions to the brand, what is the emissions on the farm, and roll out a program where the farmer is incented, financially incented, to look at their baseline, to improve through the adoption of new practices, and the farmer gets paid by virtue of Regrow technology being brought to them by the brand or one of their buyers.
So money obviously talks, and from the farmer's perspective, whether they have that impact mindset or not, money is a really great way to incentivize good behavior change. One of your recent articles talks about the importance of partnering with upstream suppliers and having co-incentives to make change with regard to Scope 3. Can you first start by defining what Scope 3 emissions are? Let us know why they're harder to measure than 1 and 2, and then explain why Regrow can have an impact on helping businesses with Scope 3.
So I'm expecting to have a very quick answer, but hopefully I'll keep it light. So what are the different scopes of emissions? So think of a concentric circle. Ultimately, we can make a line out of it, but it's not really, nothing really is a line. We just think of it like that. Should we like to simplify? So if you started with yourself, maybe you're a farm, maybe you are a food manufacturer, whoever you are, whatever are the activities that produce emissions that you personally do, or your organization does, that's scope 1. So you're starting from closest to you is 1. A little bit further away, what are you doing on transportation? Where are you fetching things? We as people, how do we commute to our offices if we have those? How do we see the businesses that we buy from? How do they move things around? Where do they buy electricity? So these enabling factors, like electricity and transportation, they fit into the scope 2. But there's this layer between your own businesses and facilities and someone else's businesses and facilities. Under someone else's, they're technically a scope 3. It's almost like thinking from a third person perspective. There's a first person, scope 1. Then there's a third person, someone who supplies to you, who you buy from, or who you supply to. That's the relationship that you're forming. So for a food retailer, grocery store, anything from Walmart to Woolworth, we'd be looking at the farm being their scope 3, because ultimately the farm is their supplier. The same would actually happen for brands on the shelf, whether it's Kellogg's or General Mills or any other brands you can think of that you can walk into a supermarket and buy. The farm is their scope 3 as well, because they have their own facilities and they have the transportation and electricity and other provision layers. And then they ultimately have further away from the farm. So as you can just start hearing, it's quite complicated, simply because we don't yet have a really great level of visibility. And by visibility, I don't necessarily mean traceability. So we don't necessarily have to know this came from Hunter's farm and it's in South Australia and this is all what matters. We should be able to trace to, say, a supply shed or a processing facility. And then the processing facility has its draw zone from the supply shed. That is equally as important for the resilient system because we have some flex in the system.
When you say supply shed, what do you mean by supply?
Yes, it's a great term. It effectively means if we imagine a map and you look at a map of, say, simple like crop production. Now you look at the map of a state that you know, and you have all the coloring in it that shows you where a commodity is produced that particular year, for example. And maybe you have a facility right in the middle of it that draws from all of those farms because that's cost effective. Shipping costs are lower, emissions are lower. That's your little supply chain, potentially. What do you buy from on the landscape? So between your first and second question, somewhere there, we needed to transfer from what is scope 3 that hopefully that we now covered. And the ability to see into that is quite a challenge. So it sometimes is very helpful to skip the layers and actually have the relationships, but going all the way from a box and knowing the facility to the map, literally to the map, knowing that if we source rice or wheat and it get processed into this facility, we know what radius we source it from. But let's straight away look at the map of what gets produced into that area. Maybe we know exactly the farmers we contract with, and they tell us we want to collaborate and be part of this program. And then there's direct relationship with those fields where it's grown and the data is exact. But there's also an opportunity to say, okay, we're just sourcing in aggregate. We're not able to trace, and maybe it's less important for us to trace down to the field because it implies direct purchasing contracts, which implies a little bit more fragility in the system, unlike what we all want to think. This is nice and cool to have traceability. We also are breaking things a little because we're making them so one-to-one connections are very fragile. It's a lot better to draw a network of production. So if we're looking at the landscape, we can also draw some numbers by looking at the practices in that area. So in this way, a brand can really quantify the scope 3, which is the emissions in that landscape, in that supply chain, and then see the opportunities to reduce those emissions. Maybe the farmers yet have the opportunity to adopt some positive practices or reduce some emissions, and then truly go prioritize those opportunities and engage with farmers into these incentive-based programs that lead to generation of what's called insets, the little assets that are created on the farm, the value is captured, the brand has paid for it, it can prove the relationship between the incentive and the outcome, and they can say, we've done something good for the environment together.
Awesome. Just to play back the scope 3 measurement and the degree of accuracy that is perhaps sufficient. One of the things you said there was kind of inferring that to trace it down to the contract by contract level is actually potentially not that useful because of volatility. What's more important is understanding the practices, understanding the region, understanding the type of stakeholder or partner that contributes to the inputs that ultimately result in whatever your product is. How do you work out what is sufficient look through and detail of data when it comes to understanding scope 3?
A couple of thoughts on this. My chief of staff has this brilliant analogy. He says, we need to build a car and get people off of horses and into the car, and ideally, the electric for the purposes of this analogy, rather than building our first car and polishing the chrome on it. The idea really is that we need to get the 80% done. So don't get me wrong. We love working with brands that have direct traceability to the farm. And in some supply chains, for some businesses, this is exactly where they start. And this is why they will lead, because they have that relative simplicity of being able to know the people, to offer them incentives, to strengthen their relationship, and everyone wins. But we need to initially get everyone in agriculture away from the terrifying black box of scope 3 to, hey, you can actually get some useful data just by knowing where you source and where you process, and that will start steering you in the right direction. Even having that visibility, both through giving them the baseline of the emissions that's consistent across the geographies they source with, across the ingredients or crops, commodities that they source with, that is a new unprecedented level of visibility where we're going literally from what's called book values, like some encyclopedia that says, oats in Australia have generally this level of emissions associated with them. If we talk right now to Australian oat farmers, I don't think we'll be able to identify which one of them is average Australian farmer growing oats in an average year. That doesn't exist, right? So the ability for us to look at the landscape every single season, every single point in the season, and say, this is what really is tracking, this is what's happening in the landscape, this is how this compares this year to last year, to the previous year, to other geographies where they're grown, and being able to have the real data enables us to make the real change. Because no matter how much you invest in farmers, if you use the book value is not going to change. And if you're using real value from your landscape, from either directly from your farms, of course, we welcome that partnership, hence my article, drumming the drum just on that. Of course, it's better to have real data, farmers in the loop straight away, and farmers that are innovative and want to reap this incentive, they're at the table. But we need to bring the majority that are currently are not clear on the potential benefits of potential partnerships that could help them get there. And believe me, they all want to leave their farms to next generations. They are the people who've been working potentially the hardest as part of the supply chain. So they surely want to shore up their future and invest in resilience and risk mitigation. So how can we help them and their partners across the supply chain work on this? We'll eventually bring everyone to 100%, of course. That's the dream. Right now, let's start with getting off the horses and into more environmentally friendly transportation.
You've made extraordinary progress across working out what data sources are relevant to enact change and understanding the incentives of people within the supply chain of all kinds of businesses. You started off with fluorostat back in 2016, and I imagine it's been an extraordinarily challenging journey. In the early days, what was your biggest challenge? What was kind of the moment where you're like, oh God, am I going to get stuck here? Am I going to be able to fulfill my vision?
Great question. I think for every founder of a company, probably what matters the most is getting to a real product market fit. And I think I've been pretty relentless about it. That is hard for me to say, but I know the people you've spoken to said to me. So those early investors, those early supporters, those early mentors, that's how they describe it. And I think you really feel it when you have it. And like right now, Regrow has it. It looks like people knocking on the door. It looks like people saying, we are trying to solve this. We know you're coming at it from the farmer first, agronomy first perspective. You know you're trying to fix it on the farm. and you're friendly to companies that have to do it and want to do it the right way. So that's what product market feels like. And I guess it doesn't feel like many other things. It doesn't feel like pushing into the market. It doesn't feel like people saying, I don't care, I'm confused. So I think the challenge around the product market fit in agriculture, in ag tech, and climate tech is real. And for us, we really needed to expand all across the supply chain to truly find the right people with the right alignment of incentives to be able to put this business model together. And a lot of people have done it differently in the earlier days of the space. And a lot of people are now trying to shift into what we have, but there's always going to be competition, which is good because it means people care, they want to do something about it, will innovate together faster. But I think just not forgetting who we're here for. And it's not one incentive type or the other. It's really the transition of the industry, an ultimate trajectory for the planet heat up. That's what it is. Yeah. So I'd encourage everyone to understand what their product market fit truly is or isn't and keep digging there.
To probe a little more, it seems like Regrow hasn't taken the easiest journey. You know that to solve your problem requires a lot of moving pieces, a lot of stakeholders engaged, and a level of technology innovation that you couldn't just switch on overnight. Were there challenges around people trying to push to go for the short-term win versus sticking to your long-term vision?
There's always incentive around that. I think it's a great question. I do think as an entrepreneur, though, that this hasn't been just going into a cave for 6 years and imagining this glorious solution. And if we're talking 6 months from now, I'll tell you what the next iteration is, because we keep building, because the world keeps evolving, because we finally got, COP to pay attention to biodiversity. Like all of these things they'll keep moving in the right direction because we are on a very short and tight rope as a planet. So it'll keep evolving. Looking back, I think from the start of the business, I keep saying this to people, and it doesn't always stress me. The fact that we're a venture-backed startup doesn't mean we should be seen as this cliche Silicon Valley, we burn money, don't care. Like, it's the opposite of our experience. I mean, let's not forget, I'm Ukrainian. I bootstrapped this damn thing. Bill Salas, who was there with the inventor of the original DMDC and now is my co-founder, has been at it for 20 years. So, of course, put his own sweat and tears with his original team, and I did the same with the people who joined me on the journey early on. We tried to live within very modest budget, and the reason I'm talking about that is because we were always trying to find an actual solution to a problem that was real at every point of evolution of our journey. So where we were in the early days, Fluorescent and that solution of crop insights still exists. It has customers, and we love them and we're proud of them that they were the innovators that adopted that crop monitoring, performance management, and nutrient management solution. So early on, it was real value. And it was real value, and it has been ever since, real value to agronomists, making better work happen on farms with the right motivations. Why they didn't scale? Because there is a certain number of farmers and agronomists that will do it because it's the right thing, rather than have an outsized financial incentive to do it. So we had to keep going. We had to keep looking for a sweeter business case around this very same problem. And so we've evolved and extended the business case, and we've over the years pulled in more and more stakeholders. We started on the farm with the advisors on the farm, with those that were providing recommendations around nutrient management, seeding. We went into our processors and vertically integrated buyers, off-takers of the time, and we started liking that. And we went further downstream into the food processing and brands, and eventually to retail and across to the government and not-profit sectors, to really, in financial sector, to bring everyone together. And it's still a process that in some sectors is taking place. The financial sector is evolving as quickly as it should to respond to the nature incentives. Like, this is such an obvious opportunity for everyone. Farm is their scope 3. I will just sound at this podcast like everything is there. Everyone's scope 3 is on the farm in this industry, but it's kind of true. So if we're looking for more incentives, yes, we might need more people at the table so we can build a business case that is better for the regional supplier, the original producer, the original grower, our OG farmer. So back to the basics, it always has to make a good business case at every stage of the business. We got paid, we had customers all the way through, but we also kept the North Star of large-scale transformation in mind.
One more question on sort of present challenges and I guess how your solutions evolve. One of the benefits and also potentially the challenges with your business is the breadth of use case and value you can provide. And venture capitalists, I know this for a fact, often suggest when you're finding product market fit, you should zero in on one potential customer and find 5, 10, 50 of them with the same problem, same use case. Have you found that you are wanting to focus on certain types of businesses? I know that you talk about agricultural export businesses, or are you still serving the customers that are most urgently looking for the regrow solution and letting that lead you?
We've always had the lens of our bullseye ideal customer profile, and I think any business can actually be successful without that. But you also have to incorporate and bring around the table around yourself the early adopters. So our ideal customer profile may be a business that has very high urgency around baselining, i.e. measuring, and reducing their scope 3. And they would be a food and ag business. That can be Regrow's bullseye. At the same time, if their partners up and downstream the supply chain feel the urgency, and maybe they don't have some of the types of pressures over being, say, a public business and having a publicly committed net zero goal or regenerative agriculture adoption acreage goal, for example, as some companies do, there's still importance of having them at the table and being inclusive of this transition. This is why we work in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa. We don't get into those things right now, but that's what a holistic transition looks like. We're paying a little bit less attention to it because we want to be seeing big acres, big tonnage numbers, and the countries that have the highest GDP should move first, because this is where we have the opportunity to invest in it. But I would say it's a combination, right? Because you have to be with the early adopters because we are so innovative. This is thought leadership. This is what, not just cutting edge, but like the new standard. When cutting edge turns into a new standard, the leaders are with you. This is what you see with Regrow. We're so grateful for their support. At the same time, now it's so important for us to scale, for industry to scale this practice, to bring the late majority. And that looks different with how you bring the early adopters on board. So that's what a scale-up does.
Yeah, I like the phrasing of bullseye. And one thing that I've noticed with all of the founders that I've interviewed on this podcast is that to be a good climate tech founder, more than other businesses, you have to be able to advocate for change. And if you can't do that in a compelling way, you will really struggle, because not only are you building a product and a solution, you're also educating on the fly alongside that. One more question on the journey. This is a more recent challenge you've faced. You've spoken about your Ukrainian origins. Last year, as you were bringing together your latest round of capital, Russia was invading Ukraine and you had a close family member living there. Tell me about the challenge of trying to please a whole lot of investors wanting more and more information from a data room while managing a very real personal issue.
I think it comes down to having the first part of the equation very different from what you described. To me, it all comes down to the right relationships. And Regrow is a type of business that I don't need every venture capitalist in the world to get what this is about. But I need the most powerful people in this world that do care about changing it for the future generations to really dig it. And that's what we're focused on. We are really good with execution and knowing who our people are. And if you do something for long enough time, you become kind of the anchor for it, the magnet for it. So we were fortunate, I have to be transparent about it, that our approach to capital raising has never really been, okay, let's do this passive roadshow. To me, I have the bullseye for investors for every round and for every stage of the company. Okay, what are we going to need to do more of that we haven't yet built the muscle for in the company? We needed an investor that knew how to execute this large-scale green transition. Where have they happened before? Oh, in energy. Oh, who financed this in energy? Let's start looking there. Who has this experience of this transition in the energy that has the same flavor of being regulated the way that food and ag is, government supported and subsidized, or in some way financed by government, the way that food and ag is and energy is, both of those are. and ultimately have distributed, concentrated, redistributed, weird shape and use just like ag in that way. So that's where we focus on one side. On the other side, we're focused on giving someone on the board who then came in the form of an independent director who really knew the importance of the conversation that food and large agri-food businesses would have around Scope 3 reduction, ESG, climate goals, someone who's taken that post and taking the leadership stance in this space. And we have the EVP of Walmart in his previous part of his career who started an Intainer's gigaton project that really moved the industry towards considering the emissions and really thinking about reducing them all now, in addition to a really leading investor in climate that really digs the hard-to-abate sectors that need to move. So we're really fortunate to have support from our existing investors and from our new investors. And it was just a very unfortunate night that night when it all happened together. And I felt like, oh, we just closed the round. 2 hours later, oh, Ukraine just got invaded. It was definitely the hardest night of my life. But when you have the right people around you, I guess that keeps you from going insane.
It's a reminder of the importance of making sure that you're solving for the right things at the earliest stage when you're first raising capital.
You don't build for crisis in crisis. You build for anything to come when you have the resource and the capacity to do it. And it should be ideally every day. And I know it's very aspirational, but it goes a long way with relationships. I think for someone who, like me, prioritizes the relationships, very authentic. And I think that's why you see this message out there. And I want to emphasize, it's not like Anastasia is some version of a superwoman. Really, every superwoman in Ukraine is right now, making the change from policy to talking about the situation to fighting the war in the front lines. Like that's hard. It's objectively terrifyingly hard. What we did is kept it together, and that's important. And I'll continue to reverberate this message of just how important the world support for Ukraine is, because it's first was 12. It wasn't making any sense to anyone. It's like someone took Tasmania away tomorrow and then invaded Australia. Like, that's exactly how it feels. It doesn't make any sense. I just sincerely hope it will stop and we'll have the right relationship, the right conversations between the right people to make it stop.
I'm with you there. To wrap it up, Anastasia, and maybe given the topical nature of what's happening in Ukraine, the answer might trend towards that. But I always like to understand from the founder's perspective, if you hadn't uprooted your life and moved to San Fran to grow Regrow, how would you be spending your time?
Great question. If we delete the war in Ukraine from the history's law, for the purposes of this question, I would be very honest. I would stay where I wanted to stay before getting into PhD, before getting into business, which would be a Thai island with a Thai Buddhist meditation temple. And I would spend more time on understanding how our minds work and what motivates us and how to get to a state of peace.
Interesting. Maybe once you have an amazing exit from Regrow, you can do that and help other people and other founders like yourself to become better leaders. And
that's exactly part of the plan. It's like, what I'm going to do. It's exactly it.
Love it. All right. Thanks so much for coming on, Anastasia, and really look forward to following Regrow in years to come.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope this story inspires more people to initiate change in what they want to see it in the world.
Me too. Thanks for coming on, Anastasia.
Have a good one.